in the heart of the ancient village of Ibikan, surrounded by forests that whispered ancient secrets and a river that shimmered like silver under the moon, lived Madame Koto. She was no ordinary woman. She was a figure shrouded in legends. Her wealth was so vast that it was said she could buy the sun and the moon if she so desired. Gold from the north, silks from the east, and seashells that gleamed like pearls in the daylight. But her wealth was not the only thing that made her fearsome. Madame Koto was known for her generosity to those who respected her, but also for her relentless wrath toward those who betrayed her. It was rumored that she possessed a black amulet, inherited from her ancestors, which allowed her to curse those who dared to defy her. Those who betrayed her would vanish without a trace, and their belongings would be found on her doorstep as a warning to others. On her deathbed, surrounded by her most loyal servants, Madame Koto uttered her final words in a voice that thundered like a storm. Let no one touch what I take to the afterlife. My spirit will return, and I will feast on the souls of the greedy. Her body was buried in a monumental tomb in the sacred cemetery of Ibikan. Beside her lay her most precious jewels, piles of gold, and a blood-red pendant that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The villagers, fearful of her curse, sealed the tomb with heavy stones and performed sacred rites to ensure her spirit would rest in peace. But greed is a monster that never sleeps. The tavern in Ibikan was a dark, smoky place where men gathered to forget their sorrows, with palm wine and whispered conversations. It was a refuge for the desperate, the lost, and those who had nothing left to lose. That night, three men sat at a secluded table, far from prying eyes. Dayo had not always been a desperate man. In his youth, he was known in Ibikan as a clever and charismatic young man, with a smile that could convince even the most skeptical. He was the son of a respected merchant, and for years he helped his father expand his business of fabrics and spices. But Dayo had a secret vice: gambling. It all began at village festivals, where men gathered to bet on games of Ayo, a traditional strategy game. At first, Dayo played for fun, but he soon realized he had a gift for reading his opponents. He won more than he lost, and the adrenaline of betting hooked him. Over time, his addiction led him to gamble more than he could afford. He lost his inheritance, his reputation, and finally, the respect of his family. His father kicked him out, and Dio became a pariah, wandering from tavern to tavern, searching for the next bet that would lift him out of misery. The night he met with Gbinro and Fatai, Dio was at his lowest. He had lost even the shirt on his back in a dice game against a foreign merchant. He knew he needed a stroke of luck, something big to pull him out of the pit he was in. And then he remembered Madame Koto's tomb. Gbinro had once been a respected man in Ibikan. He was a blacksmith, a trade that required strength, skill, and dedication. His swords and tools were the most coveted in the region, and his workshop was always full of customers. But everything changed the day he lost his wife and son to a fever epidemic that swept through the village. The tragedy plunged him into a deep depression. He began drinking to drown his pain, and soon palm wine became his only solace. He stopped working, and his workshop gathered dust and cobwebs. The villagers, who once admired him, began to avoid him. Even his own family disowned him, tired of his empty promises and erratic behavior. The night he met with Dayo and Fatai, Benro was drunker than ever. He had spent his last penny on alcohol and had nowhere to go. When Dio mentioned Madame Koto's tomb, Benrose saw an opportunity to regain something of what he had lost. Fatai was the youngest of the three and the most inexperienced. He had grown up on the streets of Ibikan, an orphan for as long as he could remember. He survived by stealing food and small valuables, but he had never been involved in a major crime. Despite his hard life, Fatai had a kind heart. He dreamed of a better future, far from the village, where he could start anew. But poverty kept him trapped, and every day was a struggle to survive. The night he met Dio and Gbenro, Fatai was desperate. He had tried to steal a bag of coins from a merchant, but was caught and brutally beaten. With a bruised face and a broken spirit, he took refuge in the tavern, where he overheard Dio talking about Madame Koto's tomb. If I join in, Fatai thought, I could have enough money to escape this hell. But deep down, something told him he was getting into more trouble than he could handle. Dio, the cleverest of the three, was the first to speak. His voice was low but urgent. Listen, he said, leaning over the table. Madame Koto's tomb is full of riches, gold, jewels, and that red pendant they say is worth more than the entire village combined. Fatai, the youngest, shuddered. But what about the curse? They say her spirit doesn't rest. Dio let out a dry laugh. Nonsense. The dead don't spend gold, and if her spirit returns, we'll beat her and send her back to hell. Gbenro, with a crooked smile, raised his glass. Then we dig tonight. In the shadows of the tavern, an old woman with tired eyes watched them silently. Her lips moved in a silent prayer, but no one heard her. The moon was high when the three men reached the cemetery. The air was thick, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The shadows of the trees twisted on the ground, and the wind whispered incomprehensible words. With shovels in hand, they began to dig. The earth was cold and damp, and each strike of the shovel echoed like a heartbeat in the night. As they dug deeper, the cold became unbearable, as if the hands of the dead were reaching for them from the depths. Finally, the shovels hit the wooden coffin. Fatai stopped, sweating cold. Something's not right, he murmured. Shut up and help, growled Dio, prying open the coffin lid with a sinister creak. Inside lay Madame Koto. Her body was intact, as if time had not touched her. Her face bore a mocking smile, and her hands, covered in gold rings, held the blood-red pendant that glowed with its own light. Take everything, ordered Dio, snatching the jewels with trembling hands. Fatai hesitated, but greed overcame him. He grabbed a handful of gold coins and stuffed them into his bag. Gbenro, with a nervous laugh, hung a pearl necklace around his neck. When Dio ripped the pendant from Madame Koto's hands, the wind howled like a wounded animal. The trees shook violently, and a distant drum began to beat, slow and ominous. The three men fled, laughing and stumbling in the dark. They did not see the red eyes that opened in the coffin behind them. At dawn, the village awoke to the news. Madame Koto's tomb had been desecrated. The villagers whispered among themselves, their faces filled with fear. That night, Gbenro celebrated his newfound wealth at the tavern. He drank until the world spun around him, then staggered to his hut, wearing one of Madame Koto's gold rings. At the door of his house, a figure waited. It was a tall woman, shrouded in shadows. Her face was hidden, but her eyes glowed like embers. Who? Who are you? Gbenro stammered, stepping back. The figure approached, and the air turned icy. Gbenro tried to scream, but his voice choked in his throat. His veins turned black, and his body twisted in silent agony. When the villagers found his body the next day, it was dried like a withered leaf, and the gold ring had disappeared. Terrified by Gbenro's death, Fatai ran to the hut of Iya Aduni, the village herbalist. The old woman looked at him with sadness. "You stole from the dead," she said. "Only they can forgive you." "What should I do?" Fatai pleaded. "Return what you took." That night, Fatai returned to the cemetery, trembling with fear. He threw the gold coins into the open tomb and knelt, begging for forgiveness. But the wind roared, and a cold, rotting hand emerged from the earth, grabbing his ankle. Fatai screamed, but no one heard him. The earth swallowed him, and his body was found the next day, buried in Madame Koto's tomb, his face frozen in a silent scream. Dio, now alone, took refuge in his hut. Clutching the blood-red pendant, he tried to convince himself he was stronger than any curse. But that night, the wind carried a whisper to his ears. "Dayu, did you think you could escape me?" Dio woke with a start. The pendant glowed with a sinister red light. The shadows in his hut came alive, twisting like snakes. Madame Koto emerged from the darkness, her face twisted into a grotesque smile. Dio tried to flee, but the walls of his hut closed in around him. His last scream was swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, the villagers found the pendant on his bed, but Dio had disappeared. Some say his spirit wanders the forest, trapped in an eternal nightmare. Since Dio's disappearance, the village of Ibikan lived in uneasy silence. No one dared to mention Madame Koto's name aloud, and the cemetery became a forbidden place, even for the bravest. The villagers whispered that the blood-red pendant had vanished from the tomb, but no one knew where it was or who had it. Yet, on full moon nights, children claimed to see a tall, shadowy figure walking among the graves. Its red eyes glowed in the dark, and its footsteps made no sound on the earth. Some said it was Madame Koto searching for her next victim. Others said it was Dio, trapped in an eternal nightmare, forced to wander as a specter. But the most unsettling thing happened one morning, when a merchant arrived in the village with a strange tale. He said that, in a distant market, he had seen a man wearing a blood-red pendant around his neck. The man looked sickly, emaciated, and his eyes had an eerie glow. When the merchant tried to approach, the man vanished into the crowd, as if he had never been there. The villagers of Ibikan looked at each other, wondering if Madame Koto's curse had found a new victim, or if perhaps it was seeking to return to the village that had once betrayed her. And so, the blood-red pendant continued its journey, passing from hand to hand, carrying with it the promise of wealth and the shadow of death. For Madame Koto's curse was not over. It was only waiting